Well, a few hours ago, Russia unleashed a massive airstrike on Ukraine. The country of Hungary is pissed that Ukraine planned to blow up its own pipeline to Russia. And the U.S., UK, and Germany plan to funnel billions more in weapons to Ukraine. And Rishi Sunak gave a big hug to Zelensky yesterday in the United Kingdom. So all of this money, all of this weapons, will it change anything? And what happened overnight? We will get to all of that with Colonel Douglas Macgregor to give us his analysis and insights. Colonel, great to see you, my friend. Welcome back to the show.
Sure. Great to see you.
So let's talk about what happened overnight first, just the strategy, the tactics of what unfolded overnight with Putin launching a barrage of attacks. Reports are that this was a devastating attack from on the Ukrainian side. Ukrainians, though, saying they shot down all of it. Even 6 Kinzhal missiles, the hypersonic missiles. So Ukraine says, don't worry, we got it all taken care of. Russia says they all struck and hit their targets. So what do you make of this latest barrage targeting the capital?
Well, keep in mind that your intercontinental ballistic missiles are also hypersonic. So you're talking about missiles that fly 25 to 35,000 feet per second. We can't shoot down ICBMs. No one can shoot down a hypersonic missile. I just think it's absurd to even suggest that these Kinzhal missiles, which are hypersonic, could have been shot down. So I tend to think the Russians are telling the truth. They hit the targets. Now, I realize that people want to sort of compartmentalize these various strikes that happen over several days, but it's a mistake to do that. You have to look at the larger strategic purpose of these strikes. They've been focused almost entirely on ammunition storage points. They've been looking for the new weaponry that's come in, like your Shadow missiles, Patriots, and so forth. And they've hit several places where those missiles were located and they've been destroyed. We think they destroyed a Patriot battery near Kiev. So if that's true, and I think it is, the notion that the Ukrainians were able to stop much of anything, I think, is ridiculous. They just don't have much left in terms of air defense. So they've been destroying air defense now for a long time, which is essentially making Ukraine vulnerable to airstrikes and air attack. And the Russians have been fairly successful. There was one attempt over the last few days to enter Russian territory by a Ukrainian special operations force. And they did manage with Stingers to down a couple of Russian aircraft, fighter bombers, and a couple of helicopters were lost. So people are declaring victory on the basis of that one-off good luck. They also managed over the last few days to take an abandoned, ruined farm complex on the edge of some woods within the 20 to 25 kilometer security zone in front of Russian defensive lines and the southern end down near Kherson and Zaporizhzhia down in that region. And of course, that was hailed as a great victory because these were reconstituted Azov troops. They'd taken such heavy casualties, they had to be completely rebuilt from scratch. The truth is, those are not terribly meaningful because when you look at the entire front line, Ukrainians, once again, have lost thousands of people, hundreds of tanks and armored fighting vehicles. They're not making any progress. They're simply losing more equipment and people they can't afford to lose. And up near Kiev, they hit very important soft spots that were targeted and blown to smithereens. I mean, if you've seen any of the videos, you can see the rather dramatic explosions. And what this tells you is that Russian intelligence is excellent. The Russians know exactly where all of the new weaponry is located, new concentrations of armor from Germany, the United States, Great Britain. These things are being destroyed long before they actually reach the battlefield.
That's the most amazing part, right? They're winding up in these warehouses. We showed the alleged, depleted uranium stockpiles that were hit over the weekend on our show yesterday, and other ammunition depots with these precision strikes. So we keep sending billions of dollars. We keep sending all of these Patriot batteries and all of these other things that are getting blown up the moment they arrive. And now reports this morning that with these upgraded missiles, Ukraine is preparing to strike the Russian heartland, according to the Libertarian Institute today. They said that with these Shadow missiles and, of course, these HIMARS rocket systems that have been arriving and the additional tanks and now pushing for fighter jets, these things arrive, but they're, to your mind, basically being destroyed once they're being collected there.
A lot of them are. Some have gotten through. They did fire two of these shadow missiles into an area where there were two buildings inside the Russian defensive structure down in southern Ukraine. They destroyed the two buildings. What was in them, we're not entirely sure about. Did they kill some Russians? They certainly did. But you have to view this kind of thing from the vantage point of what's the whole picture?
Right.
What's the damage to the Russians versus the damage to the Ukrainians? And again, the damage to the Ukrainians is unrecoverable. It's catastrophic. It's disastrous. The damage on the Russian side is really quite modest. I mean, if this were a war like World War II, no one would even report these events on the news. They're so insignificant in the context of the larger military equation. But we're not dealing with a realistic appraisal coming out of the mainstream media. We're dealing with a mainstream media that's quite desperate now to try and take any evidence for any advance or any success and exaggerate it out of all proportion to reality. So we have to understand that. In the meantime, they're not telling you about the thousands of dead and wounded Ukrainians, the destruction of, 30 tanks here, 40 other armored vehicles there. This kind of thing goes unreported and unnoticed in the West, but it's really quite devastating to the Ukrainians. And we still continue to see evidence that the energy grid is almost annihilated. It still has some energy in Ukraine, but not much. I mean, they're essentially turning the lights out on the country, to put it bluntly.
Vladimir Zelensky this weekend on his Whirlwind World Tour. He's not been back to Ukraine since that attack on the Kremlin. So he's been going around trying to raise money in different locations. During a television interview, he said that I guess he was specifically asked about videos maybe that have emerged, of course, of these recruitment efforts where they're going out and rounding up military-age men and just dragging them to serve. He said what you're not seeing is that there's long lines at all of these recruitment centers, that young men are just lining up to become a part of the Ukrainian military. He said this in an interview, and I don't know what he's talking about. Is there any truth at all to this, that these people would be going willingly and standing in line at these recruitment centers to fill up the ranks again?
Well, he's absolutely right. We're not seeing it because it's not happening. There were plenty of volunteers a year ago. There's no question about that. Most of them are dead. So you're having enormous problems now dragging people to the front to fight. Wow. Not only is their life expectancy low and they don't have much training and they don't have much equipment and they have bad leadership, but the war itself in Ukraine is no longer the popular event that it was for the first 90 to 120 days. People now are saying, what are we doing? The country's destroyed. What are we defending? Look around. Look at the cities. Look at the people. And again, we're back to how many millions of people have left? 2 million went east into Russia. Perhaps 10 million plus went west. We had a 34.5 million population in February of 2022. Now we're hearing people that say it could be lower than 18 million. It might be down to 14 or 15 million. This thing is a disaster. Anyone in their right mind would end this. Anyone who cared about the Ukrainian people would say stop and then say we've got to negotiate. We are not going to get everything we want, but we have to have an end to this. We can't survive it. But I think his masters, who are obviously not the Ukrainian people, but in Washington and New York City and London and so forth, the financial gurus, the oligarchs, they want this war prosecuted to the bitter end. Remember something else, too. This war is now becoming a financial war. You have the St. Petersburg Forum next week or next month in June. They're expecting 81 nations to come in there. The purpose of this forum is to consolidate support for the emergence of new currency in the non-Western world. In other words, getting out from under the U.S. financial system. And everyone is showing up and they're going to be told, listen, get out of your current U.S. holdings. And what are these countries holding? They're holding U.S. treasuries. All of those treasuries were bought when the interest rates were very low. Now the interest rates are going very high. So those holdings are toxic. It's the same problem we have with our domestic banking system. So these people are showing up and they're going to support this gold-backed system because most of the gold right now is in the hands of China, Russia, India, probably Saudi Arabia. I don't know how much gold is under the streets of London anymore. I don't know how much gold is really in New York City under the streets in Manhattan. We just don't know. But we're talking about gold-based transactions becoming the norm. Where does that leave us? We're entirely fiat currency. We're not prepared to go to gold-backed currency.
No, in fact, we're doing the opposite. We're going to a central bank digital currency, even worse.
Yeah, exactly. So this is kind of a financial war, and Putin is watching the meltdown in the United States. Now, some people are saying, well, this banking crisis that we have is temporary, and it's only a few banks here or there, even though we've had the largest bank failure in U.S. history within the last couple of months. I think it's systemic, and I think most people in the know believe it's systemic. What happens when they too try to drop these or sell these toxic assets, these U.S. treasuries that are no longer of any value? How do we survive that? I don't know. In other words, we're looking at everything from what is it, hyperinflation, total debasement of our currency, to what? Default?
I mean, and that's what we're headed to this afternoon. Yeah, the update this afternoon from Kevin McCarthy, Speaker of the House, is that right now President Biden is negotiating in bad faith, and he says we may stumble into default in the same way that our southern border has been widened opened. Default seems to be on the table right now.
So if you're Vladimir Putin and this enormous organization that started out as the so-called BRICS is now adding to that original number of 5 or 6, 81 nation states around the world, what do? Well, you wait. You exercise some patience because your principal opponent, which is Washington, may well be unable to sustain operations much longer in Ukraine. Because if you do have to cut spending, and at some point that's going to become unavoidable, what do people in Washington cut first? Defense. And what's the easiest thing to cut? Forces and equipment and people overseas. So I think Putin is watching for that. At the same time, a German general reported last week that when you look at Ukraine from above, it looks like the Great Lakes, Erie, Huron, Michigan, and so forth. In other words, there's been so much water. That has to dry up. That should be gone by June, maybe the beginning, maybe the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th. When that's gone and the ground is dry, then the real offensive can begin. And right now, Putin and his forces have been acting like a heavyweight champion that only uses a left jab. In other words, he's jabbing with all of these strikes and doing enormous damage. He hasn't let loose his right, which are hundreds of thousands of Russian combat troops. So the future doesn't look good if you're sitting in Kiev, if you're Ukrainian right now. Does that make any difference to people in Washington? Yes, but what can they do? They can double down.
And that's what, if you're in the Pentagon, if you're in the Pentagon, back in the Pentagon advising the president, can you imagine that? President Biden calls you up to get some advice. And that would be amazing. But shine some actual honesty and truth into that Pentagon. But to be able to walk in there and to say, so you're about to launch a new tranche of weapons and a new round of aid package to Ukraine. That's what's on the table. Colonel, what do you think of this plan? Here, this is the plan from the president. This is what we're putting on the table for the president of the United States. What do you say about this?
It will not rescue Ukraine from imminent defeat. The best thing we can do is cut our losses and get out and urge the Ukrainians to sue for peace. Tell them that we'll help them as much as we can, but they're going to have to take the best deal that they can get. I mean, stop and consider if we had told Zelensky in February or March, okay, this is enough. The Russians are going to react very negatively if we do not negotiate with them. If we don't negotiate, they're going to do what they did, which is call a halt, call up reserves, expand the force, double down on industrial production. All these factories are producing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all sorts of weapons and equipment. So instead of waiting for that to happen, which our intelligence should have told the president and told everybody in the administration was going to happen, should have said, look, it's time to stop. We need to negotiate. We'll do the best we can for you. Ukraine would probably have gotten away with virtually everything that they wanted, except those 2 autonomous provinces in the east. They would have said, okay, we'll cede those or grant them autonomy. We'll give equal rights to Russians in eastern Ukraine. We'll recognize Crimea. Well, in retrospect, right now, that would be a tremendous deal, especially if it came with neutrality. and they threw it away.
Yeah.
Washington threw it away. What will the Russians give us now? Well, I can think of the middle finger, but not much else. I think the Russians are going to nail us to the cross financially as well as militarily. And there's not a whole lot we can do about it. I mean, you got an army you can't recruit for. And if you're going to fight the Russians in Ukraine, you'd better have 700,000 troops that you could put on the ground to fight. We don't have it. Doesn't exist.
An awful idea. And yeah, we were right there. They were negotiating peace. They were negotiating this discussion until the United States and the UK stuck their nose in and said not to stop these peace talks in Turkey. So who do they have to blame for this? The lack of peace talks. It's Washington. There's
no
London.
Miracle on the Dnieper coming. In other words, There's not going to be a miracle on the Dnieper. And you've got an admiral out in PACOM, now called Indo-PACOM, for reasons that make no sense to me. Why we would have any interest in the Indian Ocean is beyond me, but that's the way we think. So we have this thing we call Indo-PACOM. I guess it flatters our vanity. And this Admiral Aquilino just a couple of weeks ago testified that, oh no, what's happening in Ukraine has not harmed us in the Pacific in any way. And I'm confident that we're still the only global power in the world that can fight multiple wars. And I'm confident we can do what we have to with China and take care of Russia too. I mean, listen to the lunacy. He's essentially implying that we could fight a two-front war. He's out of his mind. And if you compare that to Japan, remember that Japan in 1941 had an economy that was 10% the size of the United States. China has an economy that rivals us or is larger. And on top of that, you have Russia, which is now a huge military power. They have the largest military establishment, largest and most well-equipped and well-trained army right now than they've had since the early 80s. Jeez. So it's not a problem. If we have to fight a two-front war, don't worry about it, Jeff. Don't worry about it. Send me more money. I'll do a better job. It's insane. We're living in la-la land. And Americans, they're not paying attention. Because what are they worried about? Understandably, they're worried about inflation. They're worried about sustaining themselves, earning income. We have stagnant income right now. We've had that for years. Things are getting worse with each passing day. We have no rule of law at home, widespread corruption and criminality in our cities. Our borders are open. Millions of people are pouring in, and they're being offered benefits that are better than those that are available for our own citizens. So the question is, Americans, when are you going to put a stop to this? And it's only going to stop, I'm afraid, when the standard of living drops through the floor. And I think that's coming. I can't predict when, but it's hard to look at all of these problems that we've got financially, economically, socially, militarily, not expect something to fall apart.
Peter Schiff over the past 24 hours says we are facing the second Great Depression. And it's hard to see. It's hard to see for a lot of people, perhaps, the implications of that, but all the pieces are there, and all of the pieces are coming together for an absolute disaster that the United States is facing, and it's all self-inflicted. That's the really.
If you go on cable news, they'll tell you that we might experience a recession in the first quarter of 2024.
Mm-hmm. Right. Are they talking about Wall Street? Are they talking about the wealthy? Because middle America, middle class, which has been squeezed and decimated, and you can tie a direct link between the sanctions that we placed on Russia and the starving of the American people at the hands of what we're doing in Ukraine. It's a direct line. It's really a direct line and self-inflicted. Colonel, great to see you. Great to see you as always. Thank you for this, and we'll be watching what happens at the first few weeks of June as the lands dry up there as well, and we'll also be watching this next tranche of weapons arrive in Ukraine and then be blown up 48 hours later. Colonel, great to see you as always. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.